While I had an original plan for this series, it became very clear after the first episode that between the demands from my audience for more monster content and the success of my first episode of our Bestiary and Conan series, that shorter, more theme-focused episodes would be more sufficient for the Book of Gods we as a community are writing. This episode was going to be about minor gods, but instead, today we will be exploring the demonic and Old One gods of the Ape Men, Deep Ones, and others in Part 2 of All Gods in Conan, Beast Gods of Beast Men. Before we begin, I just want to thank all of you for the attention and feedback you've given this series. You have no idea how much your requests help me in doing more research that sheds new light on these gods. I actually took a lot of your requests to heart, and that's why I now know there was an entire seventh type of ape men that when we eventually do our ape men video, I now will not have overlooked. They're called the troglodytes, and I did not know about them before, and that's because you encouraged me to do more research. If you didn't watch part 1, all you need to know for this chapter is that in this series, demon gods are those gods connected to the outer dark or hell dimensions that have a negative view of humanity on average, and great old ones are those gods that are connected largely to the Lovecraftian dreamlands, also called Kuth the Stargirdle, or are described as beyond time, who often have accidentally negative effects on humanity through their very existence, void of any conscious intent. We actually see one of the first stories with the Toko Toko people in literature is actually Cthulhu favoring two humans, even though he would have a naturally negative effect on them through his presence. Now, my witch doctors, esoteric cultists, and shaman, let's begin. Grimdark. Half off! Across the Black Kingdoms, Stygia, Ventaya, Turan, and the Pictish wilderness, lies the worship of one of Jebel Sog's favorite sons, the father of all ape men, called Hanuman in the Middle East, Gula in the West, and Jula in the Black Kingdoms, is marked by his abnormal black statues. These statues appear to be made of anywhere between black to normal stone, but when touched, feel as though a living being resides within, as the stone itself is said to have the texture of living scaled flesh. It is on moonlit nights that human sacrifice is offered in exchange for prayers of strength, destruction, or protection. In line with the core theme of Conan, the more civilized the Hanuman worshippers are, the more sadistic they become. Zambula's Dance of the Four Cobras is seemingly a special addition to the traditional worship of the god, Zambula being a city in Turan or Stygia, depending on the canon of the Conan world you're currently in. During the special sacrifice, an innocent young girl is said to dance between four cobras until they bite her to death. This ritual is not spoken of in either the Jula or Gula, more savage interpretations of the god. He is said to be represented by a Gigantolopithecus, or a bull ape, which while in our world are two theorized species of orangutan, in the world of Conan are giant gorillas of various sizes, who Gula is also believed to be the father of, alongside the previously mentioned ape men, yetis, snow apes, troglodytes, and very likely the flying ape men during the time of Elder Night before the great exile of demons to the Outer Dark. While future studies will be done on the types of ape men in the future, this would mean that we can theorize before the fall that Hanuman was once depicted as a winged ape figure. This is a theory, but it holds a lot of water, given that this is the only god, and we do know it is the same god, connected to these various ape men figures and races. His view of sacrificing humans, similar to his enemy Set's developed misanthropy after a great exile, also makes sense here. So this was something that is very common within the demons of both Marvel and Conan. There was a time when demons walked the earth, and as we see with civilizations like the winged ape people and also Acheron, some of them did survive that exile, but for the most part, the beings we know as demon gods were basically of the Elder Night, meaning that these were creatures who once had thriving cultures and civilizations either dedicated to them that they were the head of or that they were a part of, and that was all taken from them through that exile, which caused a deep, burning misanthropy towards humans. Misanthropy specifically is hatred of humans. So in the case of Gula, despite the fact that his father, Jebel Sog, does want to unite man and beast, and that's how he deals with the trauma of the exile, wants to unite man and beast through the primal language, it is the case that Hanuman definitely views it as worthy of sacrificing, or in some cases, torturing more civilized humans, which is the pattern we see here, as a way of them sort of atoning for taking the spot of the demons on Earth. And this is always going to be a thing we see with every demon god. They have this negative, misanthropic view towards humanity. They are these awful things that need to be cleansed, or they need to be taught better, or they need to be united with something. They need to be altered, or they need to be killed, is effectively the view of demon gods. When not using blood sacrifice of humans, the most common ritual is that of a painted black skull being set into a fire on his altar, allowing them to perform aspect magic, summoning the giant gorilla avatar of Hanuman as a protector, while the summoner communes with the dead. A few key notes that we mentioned previously are that all rituals towards this god are done on moonlit nights, most likely due to the connection to his father. Some Picts believe him to be the inventor of time, and Set is considered one of his most hated enemies, with the resemblance the ape men often have to humans, often said to be cousin species or offshoots of humans. We know that despite Jebel Sog's son here, Hanuman, demanding human sacrifice, he disproportionately, as we see from this evidence with the Dance of the Four Cobras, punishes civility and rewards a connection to nature. So he is in line with the will of his father in that way. And when you understand the connection humans have to the ape men, you can easily see why Hanuman is enemies with Set, who is pretty much defined by his hatred of humans, as exemplified through the serpent men, who literally have an entire culture based around "we hate humans." This is most likely due to the goal of Jebel Sog's family of demons seeking to unite all men and beasts through the primal language we went over in Part 1, and Set seeking their destruction. When it comes to Hanuman, Jhula, Gula, this is one of the few exceptions I'm making to my rule I made in Part 1. The rule I made in Part 1 is that I wanted to avoid the god fusing that Mongoose Publishing often did with their tabletop, in which they fused gods that seemingly had nothing to do with each other into a singular god. But in the case of Hanuman, Jhula, and Gula, it's very clearly correct, and this is because they have all the same worshipping practices, they're clearly just called different things, and the dead giveaway is the black statues, which are talked about both in the various different religions of each god. So it's not multiple ape gods, it is one ape god, and they are all the son of Jebel Sog. We also have to remember that Hanuman is the name that the Conan Exiles team has given this god, and that they often change names for the sake of copyright and fear of copyright. If any of you were wondering why Varney from the last episode was a Gigantolopithecus but looked more like a gorilla than an orangutan, this is why. He was an intelligent Gigantolopithecus. If you're wondering how big the Gigantolopithecus can get, the answer is literally King Kong. We're going over the King Kong in Conan. King Kong in Conan would literally be the manifested aspect of this son of Jebel Sog, of Hanuman. And it's just so good because this is made for the Conan Exiles game, which has aspect magic built into it. I would love to see this in-game. It would be fundamentally amazing. As far as playing this character, when it comes to their actual values, we know from Thak, the ape man from Rogues in the House, who was the big surprise was that he was an honorable warrior on a quest of vengeance against the people who harmed his tribe and was seeking to actually get revenge and righteous justice for what happened. We know that there are such a thing as heroic members of a Hanuman worshipping group, both in terms of ape men and humans alike, but fundamentally the big thing about them is while they might have a warrior culture, while they might have anything else, the big key here that we've established through these narratives is that Hanuman worshippers are punished for their civility and rewarded for their connection to nature. And so when we talk about barbarians, noble savages, and savages, I've always seen from a literary perspective the noble savage as a mistake. I would describe the barbarian as its own archetype and the savage as its own archetype, which helps distill the two as heroes and villains. The barbarian brings back to civilization something that civilization and culture has lost due to its bureaucracy and its civility. But the savage is literally a negative stereotypical villain in fiction that exists to say, I was born without civilization, I fear civilization, and I want to destroy it for its crimes. So if you wanted to play an actual solid, not just barbarian, but a raider, if you wanted to be a raider, a bandit, who genuinely hates civilization and punishes civilized people for their increased disgusting decadence, and you wanted to be the thing that destroys them and takes their wealth from them, I can easily see Hanuman worship as an excuse to play such a character. and it would be phenomenal. So, final note, if you wanted to play a good guy Hanuman worshiper, that's absolutely possible despite him being a demon god due to his oddly pro-humanity, though not really connection, because, you still have to punish humanity. But as far as a demon god goes, it is within that Jebel Sog family of trying to unite man and beast. So, ultimately, not really an enemy of man so much as seeking to alter or mutate it, which is another theme we'll get into when we get into Dagon. Or if you wanted to play an evil side, that is absolutely the case. You can go into civilized territories that are minding their own business, and you can absolutely be the antagonist of a story, raiding, pillaging, looting, and killing till your heart's content, all in service to your ape god, who you share the misanthropy against civilized humans with. And that would be an absolutely beautiful way to do it. Now, let's get into his sister, Jhil. Keeping to the family of Jebel Sog, we come to a being sometimes said to be the sister and other times the brother of Hanuman, Jhil. Across various nomadic Shemite tribes, southern Stygia, the Black Kingdoms, and the bird tribes of the Pictish wilderness, he is known to take the form of a raven. Other symbolism includes flayed men, which can be interpreted as a punishment inflicted on those who break tribal laws, crows, which match with the many real-life escorts of the dead to the afterlife, and, of course, ravens, which represent wisdom or the bringing of prophecies Jhil is also associated with. The father of the children of Jhil, also called crowmen, and harpies, which are more raven-bred humanoids. The raven god demands constant offerings of blood where criminals or outsiders of the tribe are flayed alive, human sacrifice through blood, and massive sexual orgies of pleasure. For the divining of prophecies, priests often use the rolling of dice to tell the fates of men. Given that she is thought to have taught the Picts the way of survival and religious ceremony to honor her father, it is very likely that she is also associated with farming, agriculture, and the health of crops as well. She is sometimes said to take the form of her children to commune with her faithful, and is one of the only children of Jebel Sog that has no lunar or moon-based connections. As a clarification before we say anything more about this god, I do briefly want to tell you, if you don't know what a flayed man is, there's a reason we included a picture of a skinless man in the infographic. Just don't commit crimes in a picked bird-themed tribe, okay? Owl tribe, raven tribe, whatever it is, just don't do it. Just don't do it. Just don't do it, and you won't suffer a fate worse than gruesome and horrific death. All right. Now, well, you'll also die, but, it'll be slow, and your skin will be removed, which isn't fun. Now, when we talk about Jhil, it's pretty much everything cool about crows, ravens, harpies, all kind of built into one god. It's one of the things that I'm really grateful for is that people asked me to basically take a second look at all of these because this was such a minimal entry before, but we have a lot of research I've done into this. We have the escort of the dead that the Native Americans, in many cases, believed were going to take a dead soul to the afterlife and back again. Jhil is a great god for anyone who is trying to, because she's a god of law too, can also basically be a god of justice and righteous vengeance. So this is really awesome if you're trying to homebrew. I often talk about how you can homebrew pretty much any character in Conan, but if you want to homebrew Eric Draven the Crow in Conan, where you're like this decadent dude who was basically blessed or chosen by Jhil from a civilized civilization, brought back, and you just start communing with savage nature as you get revenge on all the people who wronged you in life, and you have like a familiar crow. Oh, baby. Oh, that'd be based. Oh, that'd be so cool. All right. But the second thing is that we have the Valkyries, which I've done a lot more research into, and there is a reason that Hugin and Mugen are sometimes displayed as these same larger-than-life figures we see actually in the Jebel Sog representation in Conan Exiles, but also in Jhil here, and that is that there is a deep overlap between the sort of origins of Valkyries. So we have murdered women who were victims of war, reincarnated as Odin's eyeless, and we can see that reflected in the sort of design here of the harpies and the children of Jhil. You can see that bone mask over the eyes. The eyeless, blind, pale-skinned, raven-winged or black-winged who chose who would be slain in war. This is a very big thing because the big thing that changed over time in Norse mythology and representations of it that I've learned is that we changed the representation of the Valkyries from the people who would choose who died in war on behalf of Odin, and then the people who would escort the dead. So they became escorts of the dead. Now it does ultimately complement the meta-narrative, but this helps if we distill the Native American actual escort of the dead versus the original Norse choosing of the dead for roleplay. And the reason it works is because we can use the raven in your roleplay. We can use the raven as a sign that you are about to, like, you are marked for death, but the crow, which would be a smaller raven or a smaller bird, as a sign that you are going to be escorted, or that you are being safely escorted to the dead or brought back. And they would say, they would choose who would be slain. They believed to be embodied by the ravens Hugin and Mugen, who would also watch over the battlefield and choose that same thing. And of course, for more evil representations of this god, because it is of course a demon god, one of the things the Valkyries were known for, that of course Jhil is also known for, is ritualistic orgies. Well, the Valkyries weren't known for that. The Valkyries were known to be given as sort of demigod wives to great heroes. And one of the things you could do when taking that Norse lore and then mixing it with the very gruesome demon god and the crow people of Jhil, also called the children of Jhil, but crow people sounds more accurate, and then also the harpies who are more raven-like, you could basically say, hey, you're now a great hero of the picked tribe of XYZ, whatever new picked tribe you make up, or a version of a picked tribe, and say, hey, you now have to pass the great ritual to ascend to divinity. You have to mate with the crow person. And then the whole plot of your story could basically be just getting out of that picked tribe so that someone doesn't have to bang a crow person. So that would be very fun. That'd be very fun. But also, if we have Hanuman, who's basically made for Conan Exiles because of the King Kong aspect magic, then honestly, Jhil, because of the divining through dice, is fundamentally made for tabletop. Literally, you can have a check. It's like, okay, do you get to re-roll? And we can check if you get to re-roll through some six-sided dice. And you could even have like a little, man, that's such a good excuse to have, because I have these nice little stone dice. I have these nice gray and gold six-sided dice, and just those are nice to do. They look very primal. And it's very nice. It's very fun. Anyway, that's Jhil. It's a wonderful creature to mess around with. I don't think I have anything more to say about it other than this, which is that if you have a pantheon of Jebel Sog forming in your head, then understand that if Hanuman acts as the enforcer, basically the militant wing of Jebel Sog, going out and destroying civilization, punishing civilization through his various worshippers, and through his worshippers who, again, if they are in civilization, have to do more sadistic sacrifices, where if they are more connected with nature, it's just literally sacrifice your enemies to me. But if you are dealing with Jhil is more the messenger style of that. So you obviously have the divining of prophecies and the messenger of Jebel Sog, and you can sort of form this kind of militant idea of a general in Jebel Sog, a extreme soldier or a great warrior hero in Hanuman, and then the entirety of the spy and communications network that is Jhil. And that would basically be her role to play, or his role to play, depending on your variation of them. I will say in most sources it is mentioned as a him, but Age of Conan mentions it as a her, so it is specifically said to be a goddess in Age of Conan and a god in other sources. But that's it. Communications aspect of Jebel Sog plus divinity, and also Eric Draven Conan. Let's move on to just a brief intermission on animal aspects, if any of you were worried that every single animal aspect is a demon because you started with this video instead of the first one. It is worth taking a small break here to speak on the differences between specific gods and animal aspects. The Great Bear, as worshipped by the shamans of Samaria, talked about in our last video, we classified as a divine god. The reason for this is its connection to nature and a complementary neutral view of humanity. The answer lies in real occult history, in which, like the bear shaman, who only has access to minor shapeshifting, many real-world groups used animal aspects, usually channeled through wearing the skin, or in some cases, in our bear shaman in Samaria, carrying a totem of their respective animal spirit they wish to embody. One could, from this, be a raven or crow shaman without having anything to do with Jhil, wolf without having anything to do with Jebel Sog, or gorilla without having anything to do with Hanuman. But if you wanted to further separate that, I suppose you could go with a monkey instead of a gorilla. Monkeys certainly have a more trickster aspect to them than gorillas. However, the descendants of Jebel Sog, whether direct offspring or grandchildren, are always about following what is called the primal language. The primal language is about uniting man and beast. This can be shown through the blessings bestowed by Jebel Sog on those that can shapeshift into wolfmen or were-hyenas in some cases. One way to simplify these differences would be to say that while a wolf shaman would have a divine respect for the barrier of man and beast, seeing both the forms of the animal spirit and man themselves as equal partners in a heroic relationship of keeping the balance of nature, a werewolf delights in a demonic blurring of the boundaries between the physical forms of both, thinking it brings him closer to what he would view as the truth of the natural world, the primal language, if you will, or primordial truth if you wanted a brief Warhammer 40k reference. For more information on how a divine shaman might behave, I have left a link to a video by E.C. Winspur below that covers the subject. The children of Jebel Sog also give us more insight as to why there aren't more were-creatures in the world of Conan. Werewolves themselves are most likely an anomaly, as the usual course that we can see from the various examples such as the serpent, harpy, spider, and ape-men, demonic mating with animals usually results in whole new races being born rather than any form of physical shapeshifting. It's still very homebrew accessible to do something like a were-shark or were-panther, as these legends of these beings did exist in real life, but understand that it would probably be an offshoot of lycanthropy, designed by the will of Jebel Sog to teach humanity the primal language. Just a few notes on this. So if you're going with an animal shaman instead of specifically any one demon god, or the Great Bear is literally just a bear aspect, and that is still the same as a normal bear, but if you're just going with bear worship, I did mention this in part 1, but having very Homo neanderthalensis theorized altars of bones ritualistically aligned of your specific animal in, say, a cave or a hut or something like that you were to pray to, with the skull, of course, lined in the center, would be a wonderful way to do that. Another thing you'll often find when you're looking at the E.C. Winspur video, or when you're looking at another video I found below, which is the Black Dragon Tavern, which has been a great help in my research, but he talks about various berserker tribes, and one of the things I noticed about that was that one thing you'll find is that, one, the transformations are going to be solely mental and psychological. Two, they're going to be heavily based around the idea of controlled militant application of these mental states. They are never there just to be, and when they are, they're often seen as monsters that need to be taken out. So even in the real world, we have this sort of mix, this yin-yang of evil berserkers and good berserkers who knew how to control themselves. Of course, very simple story ideas that do come to mind here. The first one in my head would be two brothers, one of which becomes an animal shaman, another which becomes a lycanthrope of some variety, and you have them fight to the death and have them in a constant struggle. We have sword versus sorcery. Why not shaman versus werewolf? That would be a very cool story to have, and just use that story to tell up the differences between the two. And the other one would basically be a shaman that slowly devolves into becoming a worshiper of these demon gods through the slow giving into the addiction of going into a berserk mental state. The idea of a bear shaman who suddenly starts to develop more wolf-like tendencies, let's say, over the course of his time as a berserker and protecting his tribe. That would be a very, very cool thing. I also just love the mix that the bear shaman are, just to talk about that group again, because the bear shaman are basically the template for any other animal group you're going to find. Just that mixture of warrior, barbarian, berserker, and also religious authority is just so awesome. There's just something so classical about any kind of warrior poet, and in this case we have a warrior priest, basically, and it's just glorious. One thing you need to understand, no matter how close to Jhil, Hanuman, or Jebel Sog you are, is that no one escapes death, and that even death may die, something our next god, Cthulhu, is very familiar with. We now move from the sky deep into the sea to explore the trinity of gods worshipped by the fishmen of Conan, the Deep Ones. It would be after the loss of a great cosmic civil war that the great Old One and grandson of Yog-Sothoth, would come to rest in the sunken city of Ryla beneath the stars, of what will later be the Atlantic Ocean and is now simply the far western sea. This is obviously a famous entity, but in the Hyborian Age he is even more threatening, as we do not know exactly where his resting place is other than generalities, making his presence as an unknowable entity even more ominous, inducing a sense of creeping dread the creature was originally meant to. Whether Deep One or human, the common greeting among worshippers of the mad god is Cthulhu Fatagan, or Cthulhu Dreams, also Cthulhu Awakens is another translation, representing the core goals of any worshipper. For the Deep Ones, this is the awakening of the being they view as the creator of all things, primarily themselves, for the sake of a mixture of end-times prophecy and racial supremacy. For the human cults, this is the mass enlightenment of all living beings through the summoning of the incomprehensible, only one of many interpretations that we'll be getting into very soon. For everyone else, this is an extreme manifestation of mass-induced madness that lasts for an unknown period of time before Cthulhu returns to the deep as his true nature and plans are unknowable. While in a natural religion, this would eventually result in people simply not worshipping the entity, given that human cultists are driven often permanently mad and Deep Ones view him as a god. It is both unlikely that anyone would warn a new cult against their Enlightenment beliefs, or that if anyone did, the half-mad person would be believed at all. Deep One and human cults exist all around the world, and priests of Cthulhu are known to be bestowed with agelessness for their devotion, which, along with several examples of Cthulhu favoring some humans as his mythos was expanded, would show some common sense favoritism towards those he likes. Similar to the ceremonial worship of the creature known as Yog we went over in Part 1, the savage worship of Cthulhu is done through aligning human bodies around a giant ring of fire. In the center of the ring of fire lies a great monolith, idol, or obelisk depicting the god, over which unintelligible prayers are uttered. The most known prayer to Cthulhu is the following: Fuglui Meglofler Cthulhu Wognolik Fatagan, which translates to, "In the house of Ryla, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming," often before voicing a desire or request. When it comes to this series, I have always said, hey, this is going to be about what it's like to worship these entities, not necessarily about the gods themselves. So, while Cthulhu himself is unknowable, the cults around him do practice human sacrifice, in part with making their prayers. They always perform rituals in private, away from larger populaces, implied oath of silence, which we'll get to in Dagon. Dagon also has an oath of silence and secrecy, killing investigators and outsiders, making sure that the whole thing stays under wraps. It is an esoteric cult at its core, esoteric meaning secretive knowledge. The Carter series of dream walking, if you're familiar with that. So they often know of and study the dream realms and dreaming as seen in the Randolph Carter series, believing dreams to deliver prophecies and space travel. So they effectively are fully aware of space travel through the dream realms that many of these entities do, like Bokrug that we'll get to, and also of the dream realms being their own sort of entity or place. And this is something that, again, I really have always recommended the Randolph Carter series by H.P. Lovecraft. I will always say it's his best work, more so than Call of Cthulhu, more so than Dagon, any of his other entries. They prey specifically on outcasts, and this actually reminded me of a story that, imagine this being done on purpose, basically. A group of missionaries went out to a small tribe. Now, what's important to understand about this small tribe is they were being bullied by two bigger tribes, and they told them the story of Jesus Christ. And eventually, this tribe ended up worshiping not Jesus, but Judas. This is because, in their minds, Judas was someone who outsmarted God and got paid for doing so, which in their minds was a success story. If you have an example of people going out and trying to convert people to Judas worship and trying to show them how them being outcasts or weak can ultimately be redeemed through vengeance or revenge or enlightenment, through the ultimate goals of the cult, that is definitely an example of how one might go about recruiting people. They prey on civilizational and tribal outcasts. And that can also include, of course, just weaker tribes. So, the goal of the cult is to become like the Great Old Ones. And while we did go over the Enlightenment version of that perspective, there are two other interpretations of that. The goal is to become like Great Old Ones when Cthulhu awakens. That'll be their reward for doing what they do. And while on one hand, the most positive, the most open interpretation of that is everyone on the earth is enlightened and is basically taught to think like a great old one. There are two more, which is that since reincarnation is a very real thing in Conan, and reincarnation is also a very real thing in Lovecraft, well, you could easily say they're going to be killed and their anima is going to take the form in the next life of a great old one. They will be reincarnated into a great old one, which is similar to what Bloodborne was inspired by, the idea of reincarnating as a great old one. And then in some cases it might be forced mutation. Their physical bodies are altered by Cthulhu to become like him, which of course ties in a lot to the mutation themes of Dagon worship. Now, this is a shorter entry in this video, and the reason it is because Cthulhu is effectively our gateway for talking about Dagon. But there certainly are a lot of fun themes to get into, and when it comes to Cthulhu, there are an infinite number of resources. I do have some links below in the source list, but if you want to do your own research, I definitely encourage it. There really isn't much more than that. Cthulhu is unknowable. I'm very happy that I was able to find the part in Call of Cthulhu where they outlined the actual rituals involving human sacrifice and how they would line up the various different human bodies and things of that nature. You can actually see where a similar pit of Yog would be dug, and I would absolutely love, of course, to have Cthulhu, which I'm fairly certain at this point is a public domain figure, but I would love to have Cthulhu as one of the gods in Conan Exiles. That would be phenomenal to have. That would just be great. I'm actually reminded of one of the Cull stories, where there are serpent men who've been taught to mirage themselves as humans through illusion spells and mesmerism. They've miraged themselves as humans, and they're in that society trying to take him down. Easily could see a storyline with Khan, the son of Conan, who's the king of Aquilonia after Conan retires and goes back to being an adventurer as an old man. The reality of Khan facing off against a cult of Cthulhu that's trying to overthrow him, or perhaps attaching a cult of Cthulhu to the downfall of Aquilonia over the centuries, which eventually plunges them into madness. And I think one of the greatest themes here, and the reason my mind keeps going back to the Chaos Gods of Warhammer 40k as we talk about all of these, really is that the theme of Conan and the theme of all of the gods we've talked about so far, aside from our interlude for animal aspects, is that there are just so many things that want to humiliate, torture, and brutalize humanity and take from them any of their achievements, and the only way to go against them is to fight them. So an evil representation of this cult is pretty obvious: political backstabbing, secretive cultists that control everything from the shadows, prey on the outcasts, are effectively in charge of both political corruption and organized crime. And then a positive view of them is hard. But if you were doing a positive view of them, well, we do live in the Hyborian Age, and that gives us access to a lot of different civilizational circumstances. We said before that the level cap of civilization in the Hyborian Age is medieval, but there are also Bronze Age level civilizations, and also, of course, tribal, caveman, flint tool style, moisturized tool, or yes, I believe it's called moisture tool civilizations. And those types of civilizations, if really in stress and in pain, could in fact be benefited by Cthulhu worship if they were a weaker outcast tribe that was taught how to worship Cthulhu, how to dreamwalk, how to do all of these things, and in fact gain strength and power from it, and perhaps were able to outsmart their enemies as the IQ of their society gradually increased to try to be able to comprehend the incomprehensible through kind of a naturally only the smartest members here get to mate eugenics program, and then within like 2 generations they have a very high IQ populace ready to go take out the other tribes and outsmart them. Final note on this entity, you might be wondering, hey, we have Cthulhu, what about the Necronomicon? The Necronomicon is the book that people usually associate with Cthulhu. Well, right now, that's not the Necronomicon, that is the Book of Skelos, which we have a separate video on. That would probably be the contributing text that holds the aspect of Cthulhu in it. However, Cthulhu cultists may also be separate. That isn't confirmed at this time, but we do know that the Necronomicon does not exist yet. So you can kind of decide for yourself whether it's the Cthulhu cultists that know about this stuff or whether it is the Book of Skelos. Personally, I'd go with it being esoteric, secretive knowledge of the Cthulhu cultists, which at this point in history would probably more have an oral tradition than they would a written one. and then after that have their oral traditions being passed down, being part of the contributions and texts of the Necronomicon. I think this has actually been one of the more fun aspects of studying the Hyborian Age when the Necronomicon comes up, is thinking about, because it's a composite work compiled by Abdul-Hazrad. So, you have to wonder, it's like, well, what contributed to what? What chapters are made from what initial books, texts, and traditions? But that's all. Moving on to Dagon. Created long ago to serve his father was Dagon, first of the Deep Ones, and Dagon is meant to be the first of the Fishmen, doomed to a fate of constant outbreeding in their final or strongest known form. Dagon himself is meant to be a greatly mutated Deep One, often resembling something like a creature roughly the size of 2 adult whales, with the upper body of a Deep One and the lower body of a full fish. It is apparent that Deep Ones cannot breed internally, which has much to do with the purpose Dagon was created for. He is meant to be a tool of guided evolution from Cthulhu to create a race that will be better capable of serving him. As a being trapped underwater, a race of aquatic near-ageless beings is certainly preferable. In many ancient religions, there is a metaphorical mating between entities that are otherwise related in a familial sense. This usually is a metaphor for something deeper on the literal level, meaning a deeper philosophical concept. However, we have no such luck for the tale of Hydra. Most likely the first of her father Dagon's children, the Deep One who would later become the consort of her father, was most likely born an innocent girl with odd genes like many Deep Ones after her, only to mutate and find her father under the waves, who took her sexually, at which point she became Mother Hydra. We know that certain female Deep Ones possess the ability to use magic to turn human men into Deep Ones, in addition to the ability to bear offspring from male humans for a similar purpose, and that male Deep Ones have the ability to father children with human women. Father Dagon and Mother Hydra are the ancestor gods of the Deep Ones, being reflected in their worship. In the case of Deep Ones, this takes the form of archaeological ventures which are partially guided by ancestral visions to gain more knowledge of countless lost generations of their kind who they believe to be closer to Dagon than themselves. In the case of human worship, this takes the form of the cults of Dagon that effectively function as a merchant-like deal of gold and fish for human genocide. In exchange for the wealth and food of the sea, the cultists of Dagon must follow the following 3 oaths. Firstly is the oath of silence, to never speak of what happens in any ritual or among the cultists to outsiders. Secondly is the oath of assistance, which to follow one must always help or give aid to Deep Ones or other cultists. This can be housing them or giving them money for travel. Lastly is the Oath of Fertility, which is to help fulfill Cthulhu's purpose for the Deep Ones. That is to say, one must mate with a Deep One, aiding in the full mutation and ultimate genocide of humanity into natural servants of Cthulhu. Alright, so you know that when I'm doing this series, I often try to lawyer a lot of these gods to be something like, here's an example of an evil character that worships this god, here's an example of a good character. The issue with Dagon is that he's pure evil in the human-centric sense, and that's what Conan is. It's what universes that are often grimdark in terms of low or high fantasy often are. Humanity faces an unending uphill battle for its survival against both natural and unnatural forces, including plots from each other against one another. But when it comes to Dagon, the real intrigue comes from the chances we have for various story elements. So obviously, for human worshipping of Dagon, you have your basic motivations, which can be out of desperation. This still doesn't make the character good, but it definitely makes his motivations understandable if he's part of a very poor fishing village like Zadok Allen in The Shadow over Innsmouth when it introduced us to Deep Ones. And that's, of course, the gold of the sea and the fish for the sake of the tribe and for the sake of keeping the tribe alive, but in doing so, effectively signing a Faustian deal with a very fishy devil for the genocide of your entire species. And now another way you could have a Dagon worshipper is if you did have someone from a normal town or city, but they quickly find out their child is getting supernatural visions, and people often give him, let's say, answers about these visions and are trying to help the child. And that way, what you could have is, okay, I don't want to be a Dagon worshiper, but either me or my wife has this Deep One gene, and we clearly passed it on to our kid. And this is another big thing with the Deep Ones. It's the reason their culture is so fundamentally chaotic. The reason we have those archaeology missions of Deep Ones is that most, if not all, Deep Ones, I don't know an instance of a pure Deep One being born. Most, if not all, Deep Ones are pretty much ex-humans who were born with the gene and then slowly over time became one of their kind through intense visions that change their personality by giving them visions of their ancestors that call them to the ocean. If you're a non-active, Deep One carrier and you're just a normal human but you want to do right by your kid and you want to give them the best possible life, you're going to go out and you're going to convert to the Dagon worship so that your kid can have a long-lasting life as a Deep One instead of being killed as a gill-filled freak. Then, we also, of course, have food. Starving man may be visited with the offer to become a cultist or the Deep One concubine of a female, which is, again, another big thing. Survival, just basic survival. If you think that we talked about this before. This is an angle we often failed to mention when we were talking about Cthulhu. But generally speaking, a lot of times these cultists, when they're preying on the outsiders of society, that also means extreme resentment. And if you're a starving man who just feels like you've been abandoned by society and you're like, you know what, fuck humanity, we're on the winning team, we're on the winning side because we are going to conquer them, we're going to destroy them, these worthless people who can't even manage to keep their own people alive, including me, I'm just going to go join the Deep Ones, I'll absolutely take the deal to become a Deep One. And of course, story ideas with this. You could have a wealthy fisherman that hires your party to go rescue a child, only to find out that that child was a Deep One and that the esoteric cult of Dagon was definitely involved. And of course, with archaeology, you can also make Deep One archaeology a source of elder magic or eldritch magic for your team, if any of your team specializes in that, if you're doing a sorcerer party, if you will, and they can go off and look for those archaeological ruins with the Deep Ones, perhaps making a kind of Machiavellian politics-playing deal with the Deep Ones to get some of that knowledge in exchange for handing over something like a group of people, or perhaps a group of people that's trying to exterminate them. We know that frequently one of the reasons they have their oath of secrecy is a lot like what happens with the FBI in the 1920s. We know that probably throughout all of history there have been bands of warriors that team up to go hunt and slaughter the fishmen. I always get angry that I haven't done my Deep One culture video yet. One of the things that you can often take from the esoteric cult of Dagon, if you are role-playing a member of them or you have a group of villains that is them, and it's just an interesting note, this seems to be a natural part of emerging Deep One culture, like culture from the blood. Which is that they don't really believe in personal property. They have a communal sense of property, and this can be reconfirmed in Conan issue number 36 from 2007, which was part of Marvel's later run in the early 2000s, in which we have a very good exchange between Conan and Deep One that he's stealing things from. And very specifically, he never says, those jewels belong to us, those jewels belong to me. He says, hey, those jewels belong to the people of the sea, the people of the ocean, which are the Deep Ones. And so that culture does get taken into the very communal or commune-based cult of Dagon. I feel like that is a brief note I could make. I don't think you're going to find that note in many other videos, which is just that they do live in communal structures rather than a sense of, I have a house, you have a house, let's keep this hush-hush, which it would be in the 1920s. This is more of a time when it is very much a cult right out of the Thulsa Doom cult that you would find in the Conan movie from 1982, which we also talk about where that fits into Conan canon in Part 1. Lastly is a tragedy tale that I came up with, I thought of, which would be really nice, which you could have a martyr hero who finds out he is slowly shifting into a Deep One, and through the visions that he has, chooses to fight against that desire to go to the bottom of the sea and becomes a priest of Mitra to side with his humanity, even as he slowly mutates, eventually committing suicide, or he becomes a priest of Bokrug to live as best as possible as a Thunha or with the frogmen, who do seem to be a more insular or moral offshoot, not offshoot of the Deep Ones, of course, but are a more moral or insular group of non-humans or beast men that live in similar conditions to the Deep Ones. And that's all I really have for Dagon. He's a very simple entity. He's pretty much pure evil. And if you want a good guy version of him, well, we're about to get into that with our dear friend Bokrug. While Deep Ones are an example of rule number 5 in our Why Conan is Low Fantasy video, that non-human races tend to want to end humanity, the race which worships Bokrug, the water lizard, is an example of rule 7. Humanity will also seek to slaughter even the kindest of non-human races. The Thumha, also called the Thunha, are a race of physically weak and mute frogmen, whose name means voiceless ones. In the continent which is theorized to travel between the dreamlands and the material world, known as Minar, on a full moon night, the voiceless ones came down with their god. In gross contrast to the Deep Ones, who are actively predatory towards but able to do business with humanity, the frogmen of Minar are said to be nearly wiped out by the men of Sarnath solely for their disgusting appearance. Despite their relatively peaceful behavior and strict karmetic reflecting legal structure, they were targeted for their appearance and what seems to be an evolutionary disgust reaction. This abuse would continue for over 1,000 years until a Thunha priest performed a specific ritual summoning a giant aspect manifestation of their god. Bokrug wiped the men of Sarnath off the face of the earth, and the Thumha were said to live in harmony for the rest of the time recorded in the story, The Doom That Came to Sarnath, which is also their only lore book or time they are mentioned, but for some reason they're in the game Conan Exiles, so here we are. This story also informs us of the tenets of the followers of this faith, which are very simple. Protect the worshippers, follow the laws of one's tribe, and the sins of the father mentality, meaning that if a Thunha or human commits a crime against the tribe, they and their whole bloodline must pay for it until the moral debt is cleared. As you can tell from our notes page, it is very fitting that we are going over the King Kong and Godzilla of Conan in the same video. Both Godzilla and Bokrug are a deeper metaphor for the consequences of unreasonable violence in different ways, and that any society which plays with the fires of sadism will also be burned by them. In the game Conan Exiles, the Thunha are one of the few creatures you can get a token of friendship from, meaning that while they might be a danger to many humans, they are also capable of respecting and befriending them, and that is the Thunha, the Tokotoko people, which are like an entire culture of cannibals and ghouls, and then there is the ape men, the Hanuman ape men, so you can have some yetis and friends like that. So we know that these races tend to be somewhat neutral towards humanity. In the case of the Thunha, the worshippers of Bokrug specifically are very insular, peaceful frogmen. There really isn't a lot of negativity about them. It's ironic and very weird to me that, I know that this is the last series you expect to hear about Guild Wars 2 in, but in the H.P. Lovecraft fandom wiki, you will actually find the Elder Dragons from that series and that universe have an entry. And oftentimes, when it comes to the Thunha, I can't help but think of the Hylek of Guild Wars 2. They are unironically peaceful frog people who did nothing wrong. This is literally Unreal Engine 4 Hylek. However, this is a grimdark setting, and if you were making an evil group of Thunha, I would very much suggest them worshipping Tsagthua. Tsagthua was created by Clark Ashton Smith, and it takes place during his Hyperborean cycle, which will actually take place in the same place that Hyperborea is in the Hyborian Age, but the time period it takes place for him is 2.5 million years ago, which is even before the Thurian Age. So it does qualify as canon within the Conan and H.P. Lovecraft sort of universes. But Tsagthua could easily be the evil ancestor of these frogmen before they became more civil under the worship of Bokrug. A great way to use Bokrug, I think, would be the Thunha being at war with the esoteric cult of Dagon, and I would absolutely love an esoteric cult of Bokrug seeking to keep the peace between the creatures of the ocean and the creatures of land, and then Dagon trying to blur those boundaries. We do have another case of good versus evil, though obviously Bokrug isn't likely for humans to worship. He clearly also isn't the native deity of the Thunha. They clearly adopted this god over time, so when it comes to the Thunha, I'm fairly certain that they would not be opposed to the help, but they would still be very different from humans and wouldn't necessarily want them to, and even by their living standards, because again, these things live underwater usually. That's another one of our rules. These things, when it comes to more high fantasy elements, exist so far away from humanity, they might as well not exist at all to the average person. But when it comes to the Thunha keeping the balance between their tribe and thus the creatures of the water and the creatures of the aquatic places, and also between them and the deep ones would be great, with the deep ones being philosophically opposed to them. You could easily see an inter-ocean race war breaking out between frog and fishmen, heroic, glorious, innocent froggy boys versus the enemies of the fishy bad time. Of course, one of my last notes for this character, he is the Conan Godzilla, and his model literally already exists in-game, and that's what it is. Avatar of Bokrug is literally a thing you can summon at the Pool of the Black Ones in the Isle of Sipta, or, sorry, the Grey Ones, that they redid their name. But the Pool of the Black Ones, basically. In Isle of Sipta, you can put his statue there and summon him. I put a picture of him up. It's the one with the longer, curved horns here. And that already being in-game shows that this would be a great religion to have, especially since you can already get Thunha companions. It heavily implies friendly relations with the friendly frog people and being like, look, keep the balance, treat each other well, and a giant lizard won't smash your house down. Now let's move on to a creature that would very much like to smash your house down, and that is the very evil, comically so, and you'll see this with his infographic, Ahriman. We travel back now to a time even before the Thurian Age, when man first walked the earth. Long before man learned the words that revealed the presence of the wretched serpent men, they were enslaved to the scaled half-devils. However, simply because humanity was the archenemy of the children of Set doesn't mean they were their only one. During this time, they would war with a race of degenerate lizard men known for their hedonistic practices. While serpent men and humans are two halves of the same war with opposing views, these lizard folk were considered to be true villains, even to the enslaving illusionists. A great war between the worshippers of Set and the lizard men of Ahriman broke out, finally resulting in the mass genocide of the lizard race and the defeat of the demon god. The serpent men of Set, who considered humans a mixture of evil and the lowest form of life, trapped him in the form of a 7-foot-tall man. Thanks to his ancient demonic origins, he does not age or die. Later in history, Ahriman would make an enemy of the Zoroastrian pantheon, but for now, he schemes to regain his powerful demon form with the singular goal of destruction. The only values of the cult started by him, for him, are his resurrection and an end to all gods, beastmen, humans, and life in general. More so even than Set, this is a true god of destruction and degeneracy. His followers, like the lizard men before them, believing in no morality, for they believe truly in nothing at all. And after that sales pitch, you might be asking, hey, I'm a brutal sociopath who wants to awaken Ahriman. How do I do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. The secret lies in something called the Heart of Ahriman. This is a powerful jewel that can be assumed to hold the demon god's power and can be used to defeat powerful magic users because of its own magical power. Seeking out the Heart of Ahriman and then Ahriman himself is how you would liberate him, presumably from his current form, and you would do that in a way that would most likely also involve a ritual you would have to consult him about. He would probably kill you, but if you're trying to awaken Ahriman, you're probably cool with it. His stories are the Hour of the Dragon, well, not really him so much as the Heart of Ahriman, the thing that holds his power, is used to defeat one of the main enemies. As far as his stories go, one of the last surviving lizard folk could be trying to trick you into summoning him. You know, maybe thinking that you're worshiping some other god. We know that this is a god with horns, and I could easily see a lizard folk pulling a Lami Raja, if you will, and disguising himself as a human through illusion magic, then trying to infiltrate the Tyrannian society and go towards Erlik, and try to say that because Erlik also has horns and is depicted with horns, he could say that Erlik, their law god, was, no, this is just an offshoot of Erlik worship, bro, and you just need to worship this thing in this cult over here, and if you do, then you'll become closer to divinity, and in reality what you're doing is you're trying to unite the Heart of Ahriman with Ahriman himself, and thus release him. You could also, of course, have a nihilist death cult. That's pretty obvious. You could have an open hatred of serpent men and thinking that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. A human could ultimately develop Ahriman worship solely out of a hatred for the serpent men. Of course, that would work better if you were running a Thurian Age of Kull game in which serpent men were far more plentiful. But if you did live in either, say, eastern Hyperborea or northern Tehran, and you live near the exiled lands, and serpent men have been known to come in and out of that area, and you have beef with them, hardcore beef. They enslaved or tried to kill some of your local village, and this is just, you're just in it, you are ready, you are hardcore, ready to go, and you are willing to make any moral sacrifice fundamentally necessary to take out serpent men. Ahriman is your guy. Nihilism, of course, we already mentioned, and of course, hedonism. You think Derketo is bad? Well, usually due to the vagary alone. I mean, just the vagary of having no morality is itself a very scary thing. And not just sex acts, but violent acts and every horrible thing you could literally think of. The limit is only the darkness of your own imagination as to what horrible things you could be making excuses for. You could be literally, I joked about, oh, I'm a sociopath who wants a second arm. But what if you're actually a serial killer who just wants to summon Ahriman because you think you can take out the most victims that way, and you think the world just deserves it? You are just so spiteful and hateful towards the entirety of existence that you just know these things deserve it. And of course, as him being the oldest god of destruction, we can put him somewhere between Old One and Demon God, a lot like we did with Set before. Okay, so some theorize Ahriman, this will be the last thing I address about this, some theorize Ahriman to be a similar being to Yag-Kosha, but little evidence confirms this is likely untrue, and it is likely untrue. And the reason we say this is because, well, when it comes to Yag-Kosha, while we will later have him in the next episode we'll be going over Yag-Kosha. He is the being from the Tower in the Tower of the Elephant, and that is a pacifist magic user who is also a great old one. But no, obviously not. He clearly represents a different form. He clearly has a demonic form that is fundamentally different from Yag-Kosha, and Yag-Kosha's race are all said to look like him, so I don't really know where this theory comes from, but I think we can debunk it pretty easily because, well, for starters, his race rejected him because Yag-Kosha was a warrior race. Yag-Kosha's race was a warrior race, and Yag-Kosha himself was a pacifist. So that's why they let him go. Him being a god of pure destruction doesn't really line up with being an honorable, like, warrior conquering race. It lines up with deep, bloodthirsty nihilism. But I can see where there were a lot of misconceptions to have this. So, Ahriman, Bokrug, Dagon, Cthulhu, and animal aspects, Jhil and Hanuman. We went over all of these here today, and let's get into some closing thoughts as we peter things out. On the theme of demons becoming men and the punishment of criminal behavior, I would like to invite you to come back next time for part 3, in which we will be covering those gods most associated with law and the moral practice of magic. More specifically, the gods we'll be going over next time are Bori, father of Odin and ancestor god of Hyperborean culture, Asura, as interpreted by the Vendhyans as separate from and father to Mitra, Erlik, chief god of Turanian culture, Bel, the god of thieves, Yag-Kosha, as mentioned previously, Agamotto, from a Marvel Conan perspective, you'll probably know that if you know Doctor Strange, Algorithm, Doctor Strange, and lastly, the element-focused religion of the true gods. Don't forget to check out part 1 of this series if you haven't already. If you felt at all lost or confused during this series, I assure you part 1 will more than clear that up for you. Tune in for part 3, we just advertised that for you. And always check the community page. The community page on YouTube, for me, I use it to post. Generally speaking, I guess I use it as an unhealthy Twitter substitute, and I also use it to post Frank Frazetta and Ken Kelly Conan art, and also high fantasy art, while posting updates on the news and channel videos that I'm working on. As always, I have a Venmo and Subscribestar page that you can donate to if you enjoyed this video. That is always linked below. That's about it, I think. Tell me what video ideas you'd want me to do in the future if you enjoyed this series, or if it's getting old, you want me to switch to something else. I will happily do more in the future. It depends on what I have the spark of. I get very bipolar with this channel, so when it comes right down to it, just, your comments will be listened to. I hope this video proved that, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.